I'd like to introduce our first two speakers. They're going to come up together from Indo-Pacific Command. The first one is Commander Andy Helchinger. So Andy currently serves as the branch chief of the competition branch in the Future Plans Directorate of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Andy entered service as a 2002 graduate of the Naval Academy. He then went on to earn his pilot wings and eventually became a P3C mission commander and instructor pilot. He's served in several different areas of responsibilities, and then as well as ground tours as in Task Force 72, U.S. Pacific Fleet, where he served as the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force liaison officer. And also in the Director, Warfare Requirements, Resources, and Force Structure, respectively. Okay, so that's Andy. Along with Andy today for our first presentation will be Mr. Joel Johnson. Joel has been the Civilian Counter-Terrorism Plans Manager in Indo-Pacific Command J35 Future Operations Division since 2005, with actual duty requirements that have allowed him to be a crisis planner for every crisis, contingency, near miss in the Indo-Pacific for the last 15 plus years. Prior to his civilian job, Joel was an Army officer with commands in 1st Special Forces Group at the A-Team, company, and battalion levels. He also served at Special Operations Command Pacific and U.S. Army Pacific, where his last assignment before retiring was as the G3 Plans Chief for USARPAC. Joel started off his career in the military in Korea, as any good lieutenant in the Indo-Pacific does. And he's the principal author of PACOM's contingency plans for counterterrorism and counter-WMD response. Also, the Indo-PACOM Response Forces Appendix to the Theater Campaign Order. And Joel routinely provides training to the staff and other government agencies on crisis response capabilities. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to turn the floor over to Andy and Joel for their presentation. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being a part of this great event here, and we're all excited to hear from both of you today. So we'll get your slides up on the screen, and then we will turn it over to Andy and Joel. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Lumpy. Can you hear me? Am I coming in good?
Yep, you are loud and clear.
I think what Andy and I agreed to, I was going to start this off and as soon as I can turn it over to Andy, because I in a way, when I heard you were running this up, this conference, I thought, man, this would be a great chance for the competition group that we've been developing and been working in the future operations of PACOM to explain what they're doing. Before I get to that, if I can have just a few minutes to kind of give a quick story. I hope it's not like a princess throwing a family under the bus or anything, but talk about where Indo-PACOM has been since I joined there in 2005. Irregular warfare has really been an afterthought. And as the Green Beret on the staff, they always came to me as the irregular warfare expert, because it never was integrated into any of our plans. And I'm going to talk that as we get through here, but we never really integrated it, especially from the conventional side. And it's just not something that is kind of instinctive within the command. So when I first came in, we wrote a counterterrorism campaign that was based on, and very successful, and it was based on a buy with through. And that campaign plan we wrote for the counterterrorism plan is things that, yes, I know there's several first groupers up here that we were doing in theater even well before 9/11, and then after 9/11 we codified it, we put it down in writing, but it's basically the things that we had been doing all along to work with our interagency partners, to work with our host nation partners to defeat violent extremism. As the irregular warfare concepts developed, they have never really been integrated into our commands as we came up. But when Admiral Davidson took command 3 years ago now, he started the competition piece. And since then, I've been trying to kind of raise a little bit of a group effort to get people from away from the thought that CT is equal to irregular warfare, IW is equal to SOF. That when we start talking this, it's a lot more than just CT, SOF, irregular warfare. And in fact, I would say what SOCPAC does, and I know Mr. Bill Moore is excellent at this, and he's going to give a good presentation on how they looked at things. But SOCPAC has done a great job of transitioning what was counter-violent extremism efforts to more of a competition-based. And I know Bill's going to talk that later. So what I've asked Andy to do is to give how it's going to be more of a conventional approach, because like I said, SOCPAC has been doing and been looking at this even before Admiral Davidson took over, but how they are looking at the competition piece and understanding gray zone, irregular warfare, competition. They all may not be synonymous. They all have their little pieces to it, and each is a little bit, there's nuances there, and maybe we don't even have the right doctrinal, because if all we have is traditional warfare and irregular warfare, maybe we are missing something for competition. As an operator, I don't want to go there, because I know between Bill and Andy and a lot of other big thinkers on here, that's kind of the doctrinal piece y'all can work with. But I kind of wanted to show it as a matter of, here's where we're at, here's what we're saying at INDOPACOM, and then kind of as we get into discussion, how it can be better support, especially to Andy and his competition operational planning group. That's really, he is tasked to turn the concepts for competition into actions, and that's a pretty large task. And I know he'll get into that, but he's got a pretty significant task to him and the group he oversees and has to manage. So I want to set Andy up and then start that discussion. So I can go to my first slide. Okay, this is a slide of kind of how we see our campaign and our campaign plan. Probably a lot of you out here, I know a lot of the people that I've seen sign up have been part of PACOM before, so this is nothing new. We see we have half the world's surface that INDOPACOM, the 4-star Combatant Command in Hawaii has overseas. At 60% of the world population. It's estimated to be, it'll be 70% by 2050. We have 2 billion connected to the cyber domain and within our AOR. 24 of the 36 global megacities with a population over 10 million. 70% of the world's GDP, and that's probably an underestimate if you kind of look at what the United States provides. Part of that. 7 of the 10 largest militaries. So when we talk our AOR, we are talking really the engine for the world. I understand Europe, and I don't want to get any arguments with UCOM people, but Asia, in our perspective, is the critical for our future. And our threats down here, of course, we have China, and I know that's probably been discussed a lot. DPRK, the unpredictableness, we don't know, and it always impacts things, especially from a deterrent standpoint for DoD. And then we have violent extremists. We have over 60% of the world's Islamic population. Now, if you look at the number of violent extremist groups we have in our AOR, it is small compared to other regions. I think up until 2005, we were probably a little bit more concerned, but we've seen our partner nations and the law enforcement and other agencies of government really affect down here. Yes, you've had Mumbai and you had the Holy Bakery, but overall, it's a persistent threat, but it's a threat that our region seems to have, in our countries and our partners, have handled. And of course, Russia has a significant Pacific capabilities. We don't see Russia as Europe and UCOM, and my friends in UCOM, and we'll get in arguments over Russia sometimes, but they are still a significant regional threat to us, especially militarily with their Pacific Fleet forces. Okay, go next slide. Okay, as I said, when Admiral Davidson took over 3 years ago, we went through our campaign plan and came up with a campaign order. And it was the concept of it was basically a free and open Pacific. And you see our mission: U.S. INDOPACOM employs and sustains combat credible forces from position of advantage across all domains to protect and defend the U.S. homeland, deter adversary aggression, assure allies and partners, and ensure a free and open Pacific. In our end state, the desired state for 2025, the joint force in combination with other elements of national power alongside a constellation of like-minded interoperable allies and partners provides a combat credible deterrent and maintains positional advantage throughout the Indo-Pacific. Adversaries are denied regional domination and deterred from coercive or aggressive activities. The homeland is safe and secure from attack, and the Indo-Pacific is free and open according to the following characteristics: respect for sovereignty and independence of every nation, free transit of international waters and airspace, freedom for coercion and free, fair, and reciprocal trade and investment, adherence to international laws, rules, and norms of behavior, relative peace, stability, and growing prosperity. So the return of great power competition is really what is defined in our campaign plan. We operationalize that. Next slide, please. In 2 documents. And these documents, of course, we take from the national strategy and the national defense strategy, and we've put them into our campaign plan and campaign order. However, I would tell you that this document and our documents, the campaign plan and campaign order, are very conventional military centric. They really don't address, and I know Bill Moore is going to get into this more, but from my perspective, they don't really address either irregular warfare, gray zone competitions, or where they do, it is hidden away in annexes. And there's really this perception that a lot of the things, especially the things that SOCPAC and the SOF community looks at, and the information support community looks at, that may not be translated throughout completely through our competition piece. And if you look at our 2 documents, the documents that we look at that guides what we're doing and that guides the competition planning group that Andy leads. Next slide, please. And next build. If I can do a build here real quick. Our campaign plan next. It doesn't reference irregular warfare at all. It does mention some of the aspects to it, like if you search for military information support operations, it is buried in paragraph 4. Now, granted, there's an annex for it, but it's not right something you're going to see roll up. Counter-terrorism, counter-violent extremists, violent extremism is mentioned, and it's only mentioned really toward the SOCPAC piece. And it does not, if you look at the tenets of irregular warfare, those operations and activities, you're not going to find them in our campaign plan. In our campaign order, and truth in lending on the campaign order, my branch actually owns the editing of this. We take inputs from other people. So I'll get the next build. Next, you won't find irregular warfare very much in there too. It is mostly SOCPAC tasks that SOCPAC has put in there. There's one that SOC Corps put USFK. It will have some things, but it will not address COIN. It doesn't address counter threat networks except as an annex. So stabilization is not really addressed in our campaign order at all. So it is a very, it's just in our documents, you don't have all the things that the irregular warfare working group is doing in DC, and all those doctrinal things are not carried over into the campaign part of US INDOPACOM. Now, deliberate plans, I don't, that's not my field. I'm looking at what we're doing now in theater and how we do it. And so that's where the competition realm where this is coming up. Okay, next. So I would say that those documents are just not integrated into our campaign level planning. But if you look at what we want to do, you look at the commander's guidance and his end state, that the competition piece really uses a lot of those activities and can be developed more into it. So that's kind of the part I want to go into, is that pass off to Andy on is the competition piece, is where if there is irregular warfare concepts, gray zone concepts, what he's doing is the place where we're going to find them. So that's all I have. Olympia, before I hand it off to Andy, anything for me?
No, thanks, Joe. That's a great primer for when we turn it over to Andy. And I know we've got a lot of questions and comments coming in already. We're going to save those, ladies and gentlemen. The format for today is something like day one, where we're going to hear from all of our presenters. And then the very last thing we're going to do today is a combined question and answer panelist discussion. One thing I would ask for Joel, for all of our speakers today, Andy and everybody else, Bill and Bob, if you could, we have a large audience that are not U.S. military, that are U.S. other agencies and organizations, non-government organizations. And we also have a very large foreign partners and friends and allies in the audience. So we tend to go down the acronym road all the time, and we don't even know we're doing it. So for everybody, for every time you throw an acronym out there, if you don't mind, just remember in the back of your head, hey, maybe I should spell that one out or say that one, so we all know what you're talking about. So with that, thank you again, Joel. It's a great lead into Andy's brief. And so Andy, I'll now turn it over to you. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you, Lumpy. Just to reiterate, my name's Commander Andreas Helchinger. I'm the Competition Branch Chief in the Future Operations Directorate, or the J35, for those that are unaware of our Napoleonic structure, here at US INDOPACOM. I want to start my presentation by thanking you, Lumpy, and then also the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies for hosting this virtual event and inviting me to speak on the competition OPG process here at US INDOPACOM. Just as a brief introduction to myself, I know you already went through a little bit of that. By vocation, I'm a P3 pilot, or a maritime patrol reconnaissance aviation pilot. I've got 2,500 flight hours, and obviously around the world, but specifically, I was stationed here at Kaneohe Bay, VP9, VP47, VPU2. Numerous deployments and detachments to 7th Fleet, which is the Western Pacific, as well as around the world, but specifically here in the US INDOPACOM AOR. And I've also been stationed at Misawa Air Base, where I was part of Commander Task Force 72, the P3 at the time, now P8 folks in Japan. For the U.S. military, and then also as the executive assistant to the N8 at PAC Fleet. By avocation, I have an undergraduate degree from the United States Naval Academy in history, and then I've also, my master's degrees, I've studied strategy, strategic studies, and a master's of science in joint planning. So with all of that out of the way, thank you, Lumpy. I appreciate this opportunity. Next slide, please. All right. In my opinion, no discussion on strategy is complete without the picture of Clausewitz. And so that's why you have a picture of him on the screen along with Sun Tzu. These two are often associated with what are viewed as the left and right boundaries of strategy. These two individuals encompass their Western and Eastern ideals. Now, it's my opinion that these two strategists are not in opposition to one another, but are in fact complementary, and I'll dive into that a little bit later here. In competition, it's imperative to draw from both, using concepts derived from both, to inform our operational approach inside the competition domain. On the left, you'll see what is most likely the only known picture of Karl von Clausewitz, the 19th century Prussian general and patron saint of Western military strategic thought. And for those of you that don't know, it's from Clausewitz, where we draw terms like center of gravity, the fog of war, the friction of war, and exceeding the culminating point of victory. And it's from his uncompleted masterpiece we received the dorm room poster material, War as a Continuation of Policy by Other Means. Sometimes that's mistranslated into politics by other means, but I won't really dive into that there. And also his definition of war, then that war is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. On the right, you'll see the ancient Chinese philosopher or strategist Sun Tzu, or what I should probably say is a representation of the several people that most likely make up his philosophy. Sun Tzu's history is obviously a little less certain, since it occurred probably in the 6th century BC, so some 2,600 years ago or so. In his masterpiece, The Art of War, Sun Tzu strays well outside the strict bounds that Clausewitz sets for himself and delves into areas that are later probably considered grand strategy and international statecraft to a degree. His work is widely based on deception, intelligence, and knowing the enemy as well as you know yourself. And that's where you get his quote: "If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." But more importantly, from Sun Tzu, I'd like to draw attention to the quote: "It is the acme of skill to subdue your enemy without fighting." And this will come up later in the presentation. And earlier, I kind of talked about where they're a little bit complementary, and where I see that they kind of fit into each other is through the use of intelligence and deception. And people often criticize Clausewitz for not really, discussing that. And I don't fault him, but I would argue that he does actually discuss that when he describes the fog of war. And really the way I see that is he is kind of working with this idea of imperfect information. And you have to then make decisions or make assumptions without a complete understanding of the operational or the strategic environment. And so he really kind of covers that fog of war area. And I imagine he would have gone into more detail, but obviously his life was cut short by cholera, and his work was then put all together by his wife and several others. And then we get the translations from Peter Parrott and Michael Handel, who was from the Naval War College, and several others have made attempts to work on his treatise. Regardless, the takeaway from this slide is that in competition, our dear Uncle Carl is insufficient. He dialectically sticks strictly to war and the use of violence to compel his enemy to his will. In competition, we're forced to broaden that horizon and conduct activities that fall short of conflict. We must adopt a Sun Tzuian mindset to win, and that in achieving the ends that we hope to achieve, we must be demonstrably prepared to fight and win in order so that we don't have to end up fighting at all. Win before fighting. You may have heard that several times before now. All right, next slide, please. So that being said, I'm going to immediately contradict myself. In the previous slide, I talked about the importance of broadening our horizons and not restricting or limiting our thinking and the activities that we can conduct in order to achieve our ends. And I agree with that statement. And I take that from Everett Carl Dolman, who he doesn't like to strictly define strategy because that'll end up restricting what it is that you end up discussing. And strategy is such an enormous concept that I think competition has some of the same parallels or analogs. But I'm talking about the OPG process, and in that process, it's important to place boundaries, just as it is now, due to time and purpose. We could discuss these things ad infinitum, and we would run out of time in order to come up with things. So time, which obviously is the ever-diminishing constant that we never have enough of, and our leadership demands that we efficiently find operations, activities, and investments, or what we call in the building OAIs. In the U.S. INDOPACOM headquarters. Let me be more specific. That will achieve accomplish our objectives. Every planner wants more time to explore the margins of our multivariable, interdependent environment. But that analysis has the potential to stall all the activities and allow value opportunities to pass and give strategic advantage to our adversaries. His name escapes me now, but the inventor of the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. This kind of fits within that. It's like at some point, your observation has to stop. You have to orient what it is that you are trying to accomplish, and then you have to make a decision. And then you have to act on that decision. And then again, obviously, that loop begins again. It's an iterative process. And then also purpose. And here I'll use another Clausewitz quote and extend it past what I imagine he'd be comfortable with. But since he's dead, I give myself a little bit of free reign here. Is the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish by that test the kind of war which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. And in the OPG, we will then define competition as such: the employment of military power short of armed conflict in the pursuit of strategic objectives. Now, there are implicit and explicit ideas communicated here in this definition, and I will state them here explicitly. The explicit ones being the activities that we are engaging in are intended to be short of war. The OAIs we conduct, the operations, activities, and investments that we conduct, these are not the first steps on some road to crisis. At least that's not what we intend them to be. Our OAIs are intended as a deterrent to conventional military attack, and we do not seek to instigate one. That goes against what Joel mentioned as our end states. Also stated explicitly is our focus on the use of military power. Our decisions are informed by the use of the other levers of state power, the diplomatic, the informational, and the economic within the environment. And you can use dime fill or you can use dime. I'll stick to dime just in the interest of brevity. By adversary and ally, partner, and even autonomous, and by autonomous, I mean they don't have any linkage to what we do in the building at INDOPACOM, other government agencies alike. But we have to recognize and be cognizant of their usage, because in any complex environment, these interdependent variables will have either beneficial or adverse reactions that may have been contemplated or may have been unrecognized when whoever it was, pulled on that lever of state power. But as I allude to, in the competition OPG and in the US INDOPACOM, we stick strictly with the only lever that we have the authorities to use, which is the big M of military power. So implicitly stated in the definition, and this may engender some discussion later, is our intended opponent. The competition, as the OPG sees it, is conducted against state actors. And state actors who willingly attempt to subvert the international rules-based order and are opposed to a free and open Indo-Pacific. And this, I'm sure, will it'll engender probably a pretty good discussion later. But I'm not trying to minimize the threat that violent extremist organizations within and without the AOR or transnational criminal threat networks pose to the American population as well as our allies and partners alike. But that's not typically the domain that the competition OPG resides or works within. That happens elsewhere within the building. I know SOCPAC has a huge part of that, and I don't want to steal any of their thunder, but within the competition OPG process, generally, and I know some things come up from time to time, and there's a lot of overlap of these aren't strict boundaries, but what we try to stick to is the conventional military threat posed by other nations that are in opposition to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Next slide, please. And here you have a fairly complex slide, and that's intended by purpose. Joel talked about some of the key statistics that he had during his presentation. Half the world's population, half the world's surface, and granted, I'm just spitballing here. This is just from memory what I saw on the slide. An enormous amount of the world's trade. It's a very complex environment with which we work, and we have to try to maintain at least awareness on all of these interdependent variables. I know we talked about the economics of irregular warfare and such on previous days, but many of the countries that we work with as allies and partners, we aren't their number one trading partner. And in fact, there are other countries in the AOR that have a disproportionate portion of exports and imports for many of the countries that we work with on a daily basis. So this is, I'm trying to set the stage that we work in a complex environment. So in practice, the OPG is a weekly battle rhythm event that includes at least one representative from the many directorates within the headquarters, as well as the service components that generally is SOCPAC, PACAF, so Air Forces of the Pacific, Commander Pacific Fleet, and the U.S. Army Pacific Headquarters. And those are the big four, as well as representatives from the other combatant commanders, functional and not geographic yet, but the other functional combatant commanders. The work we perform is obviously in line with the national strategies as laid out as the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and the national military strategy, as you'll see on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. But functionally for us, the J5 begins the planning process by conducting analysis of the long-term strategic environment and working with the Joint Staff, the other combatant commanders, and supported by future operations, us, because we're a little bit closer. We're closer to the, let's call it the operational level, than where they sit, without anything more there. And so they come up ultimately with a list of consolidated strategic opportunities, and they're finalizing the fiscal year 23 consolidated strategic opportunities. And I know a lot of people are probably unaware of what that term is, and I want to make sure I pull up my definition here, because that's a non-doctrinal term that has only just started to make its way into draft versions of doctrine. And the working definition of that is an arrangement of forces and activities in time, space, and purpose leveraged to proactively shape the strategic environment and further campaign objectives. And so, it's an important look, but it's an iterative process, and that's kind of why you see this handover from the strategic opportunities to kind of these emergent opportunities, and as we go toward into competition execution, because obviously, let's see, who's Schrodinger's cat, not to delve too much into the theoretical there, but observing a system has impact on the system. Even if you're just observing it or producing a plan, that begins to shape the environment that we operate in. So, like I said, it's an iterative process, and we seek to get multiple touch points on these plans. So these CSOs, they inform and help prioritize a host of other planning documents, and notably force allocation through the top-down guidance and the global management of the force, but also the U.S. INDOPACOM campaign plan. And so that's very important, because the tools that we have at our disposal are the forces that we utilize within the M, not the other levers of state power, within the M. And so those CSOs, they help inform those, and then for lack of a better term, those are the toys, and I don't mean to diminish, obviously, their huge impact, that we end up utilizing within the strategic environment here, the INDOPACOM AOR. Ideally, at this point, the planning lead becomes us in the J35, the Future Operations Directorate, who is also the lead for the OPG at around the 1 year mark. The planning director will end up supporting us through several different methods, because they have country desk officers that work hand in hand with the countries on a daily basis, and Intel will help inform our operations as we continue planning. That's the J2 up on the screen. From here, the CSOs and the campaign plan will be further refined into the campaign order, and the service components will begin to detail tactical level planning on their activities. If the environment is sufficiently changed, the service components in U.S. INDOPACOM can and often does request additional service retained forces. Then those are the forces that are listed on the immediate response force list through the dynamic force employment process. So we are not unamenable to changing the plan and requesting more forces as we see fit, because again, like we said, it's a dynamic environment, and every time you get a touch on the environment, which is every single day, it changes in some imperceptible and some perceptible ways, and that is the way that we end up adjusting to those perceptible changes. Once that OAI has entered the execution window, the current operations directorate, which is the J33, will take the lead, supported by us in future operations, and again, informed by Intel. This happens as far out as about 60 days. But I hate to inform everyone, but that often is much closer to that, and we sometimes end up carrying the water for that just to several days out, which increases the amount of work that we have to do. But that's an internal gripe, just a little bit of internal ribbing. The resultant should be a collection of synchronized and synergistic OAIs that are structured in such a way to achieve the end state of the U.S. Indo-PACOM theater strategy. And Joel kind of touched on this briefly, but next slide, please. But what does that look like to us? And this is a very rudimentary build I did in my free time to show us balancing the achievement of what our potential ends are versus our ways and means within the acceptable boundaries of risk. And DIME are obviously those state levers of power, but I capitalized M there to show that really we limit ourselves here in the competition OPG process to the big M of military. And so what it is that we're trying to achieve is a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is, again, free in terms of our traditional security in the terms of our values and political systems, free societies that respect individual rights and liberties, and the promotion of good governance, adherence to shared values of the UN Charter and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We want everyone. I mean, we understand the environment has a number of independent actors, and they are free to do, because we respect the independent state. I'll continue on here, but we want the free exercise of national power, which is free from malign influence and coercion. Open seas, airways, open markets, open investment environments, secure intellectual property rights, fair and reciprocal trade, and open access to the commons, whether that's cyberspace, space, the undersea domain. That's all part of the rules-based international order. The ways that we achieve this free and open Indo-Pacific is simple. By demonstrating a convincing conventional deterrent, clearly communicating our commitment to that deterrent to our allies and partners, as well as our adversaries. They have to be very clear, or they have to be very clear-minded on what the message it is that we are sending and that they should be receiving. And that message is to bolster our friends and dissuade malign action by any potential adversary, and that's kind of the part of the competition process, or at least the competition OPG is the malign action by the states within the AOR needs to be confronted and called out. So, like I said, in competition OPG, Clausewitz is insufficient for use in the competition OPG. It's not our desire to compel anyone into accepting our will. Our will is the mutually beneficial freedoms we've already agreed upon in the UN Charter and the respective individual sovereignty. The attraction to that should be self-evident. A rising tide lifts all boats. Other maybe more authoritarian ideas of leadership, they really only have their own selfish interest at heart. For the rest of us, we want competition across all domains and free from that malign coercion. So I'm going to highlight Sun Tzu once again from earlier. It's the acme of skill to win without fighting. And the cornerstone requirement of winning without fighting is the maintenance and communication of our convincing conventional deterrent. And that happens by other ways. We have to increase our joint force lethality. And, the services are, they're directed by the chairman to do that exact thing by exercising, across what sometimes is seen as traditional Air Force lines of effort. This sometimes has to be operated on by the Navy and the Army, and vice versa. And then, those kinds of things will happen independent of the competition OPG process, because, the services have their own, ideas as things at times, and ideas that they need to go after. But we look to synchronize those things, and we look to increase that joint force lethality. But that doesn't just limit us to joint force lethality. We're also trying to increase the combined force lethality of our allies. When we do any number of exercises that are multilateral or bilateral, or when we share information, cross information sharing, or foreign military sales is a part of that, even though we don't have any input into that here in the competition OPG process. We do operations, but we are aware of that, and interoperability amongst services as well as the allies and partners is very important to us. So I say all of that, and I know that achieving it is simple. If a free and open Indo-Pacific is simple, but by no means is it easy. There's a number of difficult things that we're needing to tackle, and we try to do that at least at the weekly Battle Rhythm event, and which focuses all of my efforts in the inside of U.S. INDOPACOM. And Lumpy, that kind of wraps up what it is I was talking about here. So thank you. I don't know, Joel, if you kind of wanted to, I know you have some disagreements, if you wanted to weigh in on that.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. Joel, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can't say it's disagreements, but just as the process goes on, and Andy touched on it, but the reminder that how DoD is organized, and that money goes through the services, SOCPAC as a SOCOM, that Andy's operational planning group can't really just go out and task components to do things. They have to come in and get everybody aligned to a certain agenda, because it is the services that control the funding. And so that's one of the keys that his group is trying to do, is to, especially when you talk the ways and means, is how he achieves those and how they align those up. It is primarily executed by the four services and SOCOM. So, and plus other functional combatant commands. U.S. INDOPACOM just can't, even though we have a tasking authority and COCOM authority, we really don't have the power of the purse that can allow those ways and means to happen. It takes Andy's operational planning group to get everybody together and to pull people together to get to achieve, as we say, free and open Pacific, win before fighting, all those great things. But how we sync everybody up is not as easy as you would think it would be.
Okay. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so what I'll do is I'll pull out a few questions from the audience just for the two of you, if you want to give it a stab at it.
No, I look forward to it, Lumpy. Well, this is the competition OPG process also is, it's not static. It's always open to input, and that obviously we'd like to see a way forward where we start to integrate and synchronize with the other the people that are even within the building, whether it's our foreign policy advisors within the Department of State is where those typically come from, and synchronizing on a regular Battle Rhythm event, I think would be extraordinarily beneficial. So if you have any other questions that you want to aim this way, I'm more than willing to help. And then Joel obviously has plenty of experience.
Yeah, if I can add to what Andy just brought up, that's a key point too, is that for the, you see all the discussion on the dime and us and other activities, there is no other U.S. government agency that looks at 60% of the world's surface, 70% of the people, we DoD have it broken down that way, but there is no counterpart as we look at the competition from we have our LNOs from State Department, we have our LNOs from FBI and law enforcement, we have Five Eye partners on our staff, but a lot of times those organizations don't have a parallel focus to us. So when we're doing things, it is not a perfect alignment to activities, because the United States government does not have a USG Indo-Pacific. Of course, a lot of the activities, which is one of the things, and I don't know if Bill Moore is going to hit on it a lot, but that SOCPAC really broke the ice with, was the engagement for competition activities, to do those at the country team levels, which is where you do get an integrated U.S. government piece. So I don't want to take in case Bill's going to discuss that, but that's one thing SOCPAC has done, has been that integration at the country team level for the DI and E's with the M piece. It just doesn't happen at our level that well, at the COCOM level. It's just not something, like I said, we just don't have the State Department Indo-Pacific branch sitting anywhere on Oahu. We got all four services plus SOCPAC. We have a lot here, but we don't have the other elements of the government other than LNOs with us to really kind of establish those competition operations, actions, and investments.
Yeah, so interesting question, that comes to my mind as you mentioned this. Obviously you have your liaison officers from the State Department, as you mentioned, and, a few other agencies there. But, as we talk about irregular warfare or gray zone competition, the theme throughout this week and, in this conversation in general, beyond this workshop, is the importance of whole of government, whole of society, to truly compete, and do you think we're positioned well? Obviously, liaison officers are good, but are we positioned well or well enough to truly maximize our ability to compete? And I know we're talking specific to the specifically the Indo-Pacific region here. Most of the other combatant commands around the world are organized very similar. Are we as a U.S. government truly embracing this whole of government, whole of society approach to competition? I know the answer is probably no, but thoughts on that, or maybe room for improvement? And I know I'm asking for some personal thoughts here because you're organized the way you're organized, right, for a reason. But I mean, is there any room for improvement to fill some of these gaps as we compete?
I'll take that just to start, Joel. Yes, I mean, the answer to that question is there room, or to the question, is there room for improvement? The answer is obviously yes. And we try, we reach out, we make sure to, reach out to the Department of State representatives on a regular basis, trying to find foreign policy guidance and whatnot. And I see the questions that talk about economics inside in the discussion panel there. There's a number of different agencies that we should probably reach out to, like the U.S. Office of the Trade Representative, Department of the Treasury. So that has to happen somewhere within the government. And, over to Joel, and if he has any particular ideas. I don't want to get into trouble, but I wrote my thesis on coercive economic measures. And what you find inside of the military is you don't really want the military doing things in the economic sphere, because there's a lot of complexity there that we just truly do not have the tools to grasp, or or knowledge or understanding of.
Joel, anything you want to add? If not, that's okay.
Yeah, no, I would, don't get me started on this one, and wait till Bill Moore gets up. But yeah, I'm sure Bill will fill your ear on this. But yeah, we as a government could be better organized for competition. I mean, it's clearly, of course, I think we have a couple of competition enemies out there, and then the real enemy is back in DC sometimes. So, if we looked at where we, we almost have to compete with DC, or compete in DC to compete with our global competitors. And that's, from a government standpoint, We made this. We've gotten better, I think, with the violent extremist organization effort got better over time. I don't think we've done it for great power as a national approach. Sometimes I think we're better aligned with our Australian and New Zealand counterparts than we are sometimes even with our other GCC counterparts. I just think that's something we could do better at as far as way ahead from a United States government standpoint.
Yeah. That hits on an interesting thing that came up in day one where we had Deke Groh from our Office of Secretary of Defense talking about, the new irregular warfare. Well, it's about a year old now, or the whatever version is two years old now. It was put out for our entire Defense Department to embrace it, to support it, to realize that it's an important part of competition and strategic competition, and yet institutionalizing it across our military is just a challenge. And you both are just reinforcing that we are not there yet as a military, right? Joel started off by saying, some of your guiding documents, the documents that guide INDOPACOM, maybe in some subscript buried in some chapters, you might find or not find at all the words irregular warfare. So if our combatant commands are not embracing that fully, some of the subcomponents maybe, but probably are not, right? So the first question I posed to you was an interagency whole of government question, but even just inside our own house, seems like we've got some work to do. Is that a fair assessment, whether it's PACOM or below? And I know, as Joel mentioned, everybody's got their own strings. So it's not as though, like people think we've got PACOM, we've got all these other components, and because you're the combatant command, but at the end of the day, there's funding lines that come from all over the place. So it's kind of hard to dictate what people do or don't do all the time, right? So it's just a challenge, this institutionalization of irregular warfare here in the Indo-Pacific, and I imagine it's the same elsewhere as well, right?
Yeah. One thing, Lumpy, you and I, Green Berets from way back and have been out in theater, we have a way of looking at things. And one thing I have on the PACOM staff, though, and this is kind of the disclaimer to defend INDOPACOM, and I think this applies to all militaries for all countries, you have a base mission, which is defense of your country.
Sure.
So, and while we're looking at the irregular warfare and participating as part in gray zone activities, win before fighting and doing all that, you have to understand that, Commander Helchinger, in his role, in the other conventional Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and for all countries, it gets up about being able to do the military mission first. And so we'll always be, I can't say second, because it's so important to win before fighting and not to go to war. But at the same time, we can never and have to understand for all the services, their first responsibility. And so we got to kind of work in our own internal gray zone there.
Okay. All right. We're almost up on our time. Andy, any closing thoughts? If not, we'll have plenty of questions for both of you when we get to the panel discussion at the end of the day. But we've got a few minutes left. If any closing thoughts from either of you, or are we ready to move on?
No, I guess to further Joel's point there, and a question I saw kind of pop up earlier in the chat window, which I thought was a very good question, is like, does our dominance in deterring a conventional war force activities in the irregular or into the gray zone? And the answer to that question is obviously yes, because it's foolhardy to go poke the biggest kid in the block, the biggest kid on the block in the eye, out in the middle of the open, right? You don't just walk up and sock him right in the nose. You're going to want to try to get at that in other ways. But that's kind of like what Joel talked about, is that we're originally, like, the very first priority is the conventional deterrent and homeland defense. Every military has its prime mission is defense of the homeland. Everything after that starts to become a little bit, and not to diminish the importance of irregular warfare and supporting allies and partners again, but everything after that ends up being a little bit of gravy. I would much rather fight an irregular war in the gray zone, with all the tools that we have available to us to do that, and not in a large scale conventional battle. History of the 20th century and even before that, Napoleon sweeping across Europe, it has taught us the large scale conventional war is catastrophic to everyone involved, not just to the militaries involved. It's catastrophic to all the populations. You don't even want to begin to contemplate that. And so if you let that, slip out of your eyesight, well, you can't lose that battle, right? You might be able to have some victories and then some subtle losses in IW, but you cannot lose that first battle, because just the end result is just catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely understand. All right, gentlemen, thanks for a great presentation. We all now better understand a little bit more PACOM's thought process on competition